Today, we will talk about 8 of the biggest plot holes in Family Guy. Let's start with what might be the most notorious continuity error in Family Guy history. We're talking about Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy, which lasted not 9 months, not even a year, but approximately 7 real-world years spanning over 100 episodes. This isn't just a minor continuity slip. This is a pregnancy so long that it becomes biologically impossible, medically fascinating, and comedically absurd all at the same time. Bonnie Swanson is introduced very early in Family Guy's run as the wife of Joe Swanson, Peter's paraplegic police officer neighbor. When we first meet Bonnie in the 4th episode of Season 1, titled A Hero Sits Next Door, which aired in May of 1999, she's noticeably pregnant. Very pregnant, actually. The kind of pregnant where you're clearly in your 3rd trimester and the baby could arrive any day now. The episode doesn't make a huge deal out of her pregnancy. It's just an established fact about the character. Bonnie is Joe's pregnant wife, and that's part of who she is in these early episodes. Now, if you're a reasonable person watching a sitcom where a character is introduced as heavily pregnant, you'd probably expect that character to give birth within a few episodes, maybe by the end of the season at the latest. That's how pregnancies work on television, right? They're introduced, they progress, there's usually a dramatic birth episode, and then the show deals with having a baby around. This is standard sitcom operating procedure. Shows like Friends, How I Met Your Mother, The Office, they all handled pregnancy storylines this way. Even other animated sitcoms like The Simpsons managed to resolve Marge's pregnancy with Maggie in a reasonable time frame. But Family Guy is not a reasonable show, and Bonnie's pregnancy was destined to become something far stranger than anyone could have predicted back in 1999. Because here's what happened. The show got canceled after Season 3 in 2002. When it came back in 2005, thanks to strong DVD sales and syndication ratings, the writers had a choice. They could have had Bonnie give birth during the time the show was off the air. Easy fix. Problem solved. Or they could just keep her pregnant and see what happens. Guess which option they chose. When Family Guy returned for Season 4 in 2005, Bonnie was still pregnant. Not only was she still pregnant, but the show started making jokes about how long she'd been pregnant. In one episode, a character mentions that Bonnie has been pregnant for 6 years. In another, someone comments on her eternal pregnancy. The writers were acknowledging the absurdity, turning the plot hole into a running gag. This is classic Family Guy. When you create a continuity problem, don't fix it. Make it worse and joke about it. But it gets even more complicated. Throughout Seasons 4, 5, and 6, Bonnie remains pregnant. She's pregnant in episode after episode, sometimes heavily featured, sometimes just appearing in the background of scenes, but always, always pregnant. The show continued, making occasional references to how long this pregnancy was lasting. Characters would comment on it, make jokes about it, but nothing would change. Bonnie just stayed pregnant, episode after episode, season after season. Let's do some math here, because the timeline is genuinely wild. Bonnie first appears pregnant in May 1999. She gives birth in the Season 7 episode Ocean's 3.5, which aired in February 2009. That's nearly 10 years of real-world time. But it's even more absurd when you count episodes. From her first appearance to her giving birth, approximately 116 episodes aired. 116 episodes where Bonnie Swanson was pregnant. If we assume each episode represents roughly a week of in-universe time, which is being generous, that's still a pregnancy lasting well over 2 years. Even if we're extremely generous with the timeline and assume multiple episodes can happen in a single day, we're still talking about a pregnancy lasting multiple years at minimum. From a biological standpoint, this is obviously impossible. Human pregnancies last approximately 40 weeks, give or take. Even the longest medically recorded pregnancy was only about 375 days, and that was an extreme outlier. Bonnie's pregnancy, by any reasonable calculation, lasted somewhere between 2 and 10 years, depending on how you interpret the show's timeline. This baby should have been born, grown into a toddler, started preschool, learned to read, and begun elementary school in the time Bonnie spent being pregnant with her. The show itself seemed uncertain about how to handle this increasingly ridiculous situation. Sometimes episodes would ignore Bonnie's pregnancy entirely, not mentioning it or showing her in ways where you couldn't tell she was pregnant. Other episodes would lean into it, having characters make jokes about the impossibly long gestation period. There was no consistent approach because there was no plan. The writers had backed themselves into a corner, and instead of finding a way out, they just kept digging. Fan theories about Bonnie's eternal pregnancy started popping up almost immediately. Some people suggested that maybe time worked differently in the Family Guy universe, that perhaps years weren't actually passing, despite what the episode air dates suggested. This theory falls apart pretty quickly when you consider that the show regularly references current events, pop culture, and specific years. Other fans proposed that maybe Bonnie had multiple pregnancies during this period, losing babies and immediately getting pregnant again, which would be incredibly dark and was never suggested by the show. The most popular theory was simply that the writers forgot to give her a baby, and then it became too awkward to address, so they just kept her pregnant indefinitely. There's also the question of what this did to Bonnie as a character. For 7 years of episodes, her defining characteristic was being pregnant. She couldn't really have storylines that didn't involve her pregnancy. She couldn't go through character development because her status never changed. She was frozen in time, locked into this one aspect of her identity, all because the writers couldn't figure out how to resolve a storyline they'd accidentally created by canceling and then reviving the show. When Bonnie finally does give birth in season 7, the episode treats it like a completely normal event. There's no explanation for why this pregnancy lasted so impossibly long. No one comments on the fact that Bonnie has been pregnant for years. The characters act like this is just a regular birth happening at a regular time after a regular pregnancy. Joe and Bonnie have their baby. They name her Susie, and that's that. The show just moves on like nothing weird happened. But here's where it gets even stranger. After spending 116 episodes building up to Susie's birth, after making her arrival this huge milestone that fans had been waiting years to see, the show does almost nothing with the character. Susie appears occasionally in later episodes, but she's not a major character. She doesn't get significant storylines. She's just kind of there, a baby that sometimes shows up in the background. All that waiting, all those years of pregnancy, and the payoff is a character who barely matters to the show. This raises uncomfortable questions about what Susie's age is supposed to be at any given point. If we take the show's timeline literally and assume that Bonnie really was pregnant for years, rather than this being a meta joke about the show's continuity, then Susie should be aging extremely slowly. But the show doesn't commit to this bit. Susie seems to age at a normal rate in the episodes after her birth, going from newborn to infant to toddler over the course of several seasons. So the show wants us to accept that the pregnancy lasted years, but now that the baby is born, time flows normally again. It doesn't make any sense. And what about Bonnie's experience during this pregnancy? Being pregnant for even a normal 9 months is physically demanding. The fatigue, the weight gain, the hormonal changes, the physical discomfort. These things increase as the pregnancy progresses. If Bonnie was in her 3rd trimester for years, she should have been experiencing 3rd trimester symptoms for years. The baby should have been full term for years, just hanging out in there, fully developed but not arriving. From a medical perspective, this would be a nightmare scenario requiring constant monitoring and probably intervention. But the show never addresses any of this because, again, it's just a continuity error that spiraled out of control. The really frustrating thing about Bonnie's pregnancy is that it didn't have to be this way. The writers had so many opportunities to fix this. They could have had her give birth during the cancellation. They could have had her give birth in the first episode back. They could have had her give birth in any of the dozen episodes where it would have made sense to resolve this storyline. Instead, they let it drag on for years, turning what could have been a minor continuity blip into one of the most notorious plot holes in animated sitcom history. Some fans have defended this by pointing out that Family Guy is a comedy show, not a documentary, and we shouldn't expect realistic pregnancy timelines. That's fair to a point. But the problem isn't that Family Guy is unrealistic, it's that it's inconsistent. The show treats most pregnancies normally. When Lois has her pregnancy scare in later seasons, it follows a normal timeline. When other characters get pregnant, they give birth in reasonable timeframes. It's specifically Bonnie's pregnancy that breaks all the rules. And not because of some intentional artistic choice, but because of what appears to be writer forgetfulness mixed with not knowing how to fix the problem once it became obvious. Looking back at this plot hole now, years after it was finally resolved, it's actually kind of impressive in its absurdity. It takes a special kind of narrative chaos to accidentally create a pregnancy storyline that lasts a decade. It requires a writer's room, where apparently no one was keeping track of character details, where no one thought to check how long it had been since Bonnie was first shown pregnant, where the attitude was apparently just keep her pregnant until we figure out what to do with her. And then, when they finally did figure it out, the solution was to just have a normal birth episode and pretend nothing weird had happened. Bonnie Swanson's 10-year pregnancy remains the gold standard for Family Guy plot holes. It's the one that even casual fans know about. The one that comes up in every discussion of the show's continuity problems. The one that perfectly encapsulates how Family Guy approaches storytelling. Why worry about consistency when you can just make jokes about the inconsistency? Why fix a problem when you can acknowledge the problem and then keep doing it anyway? Why give a character a reasonable pregnancy timeline when you can accidentally create television's longest gestation period and then just roll with it? And really, that's what makes this plot hole so perfectly Family Guy. It's not just that the pregnancy lasted impossibly long. It's that the show knew it lasted impossibly long, made jokes about it, and still took years to resolve it. It's continuity chaos elevated to an art form, a plot hole so big and so obvious that it becomes part of the show's identity. When people think about Family Guy's relationship with continuity, they think about Bonnie's pregnancy. That time the show forgot to let a woman give birth for 116 episodes. If Bonnie's impossibly long pregnancy is Family Guy's most famous plot hole, then Carol Pewterschmidt's vanishing baby is definitely its most mysterious. This is the plot hole that raises the most questions, spawns the most disturbing fan theories, and represents the most complete abandonment of a storyline in the show's entire run. We're talking about a baby that is born on screen, confirmed to exist, and then simply ceases to be part of the universe with absolutely no explanation whatsoever. Let's set the scene. Carol Pewterschmidt is Lois's sister, the one who isn't quite as uptight as their other relatives, but still comes from the same wealthy, dysfunctional family. She's been a recurring character throughout the series, appearing in various episodes dealing with the Pewterschmidt family drama. In the Season 5 episode Mother Tucker, which aired in 2006, we get a major Carol storyline. She's pregnant, very pregnant, and as luck would have it, she goes into labor while visiting the Griffin household. This isn't just mentioned in passing or implied. This is a full-on birth sequence. Peter, being Peter, ends up having to deliver the baby because they can't get Carol to the hospital in time. The episode plays this for comedy, of course, with Peter being completely incompetent and inappropriate throughout the delivery process. There are jokes about what he's seeing, jokes about the process itself, all the standard Family Guy childbirth humor. But the key point here is that the baby is born. We see this happen. Characters acknowledge it happening. Peter successfully delivers Carol's baby, and the episode confirms that the child is male. So now, Carol has a son. This is established canon. It happened on screen in front of us. The baby exists in the Family Guy universe as surely as Stewie or Meg or Chris exist. You'd expect this baby to become a recurring part of Carol's character, right? When she appears in future episodes, she'd have her son with her, or at least there would be references to him. Maybe he'd be mentioned in passing, maybe we'd see him occasionally, but at minimum, the show would acknowledge that Carol is now a mother. Except that's not what happens. Not even close. The baby is never seen again, never mentioned again. It's like the entire birth episode was erased from continuity. Carol appears in multiple episodes after giving birth, and there's no baby. No child at all. She shows up for family gatherings, for Peter Schmidt family drama, for various plots involving Lois's relatives, and she's always alone. No baby with her, no babysitter mentioned, no explanation for where this child went. The show acts like the birth never happened. This becomes especially weird in the season 8 episode, The Juice is Loose, where Carol gets married. This is a big episode for her character, a major life event, and you'd absolutely expect her son to be part of it. Maybe he'd be the ring bearer, or at least present at his mother's wedding. But no, there's no child at Carol's wedding. The ceremony happens, the reception happens, and throughout it all, there's no indication that Carol has a son. The show has completely forgotten about this baby's existence. Later episodes featuring Carol continue this pattern. She appears in Mom's the Word, dealing with family issues. She shows up in various other Peter Schmidt family gatherings and storylines. Every single time, she's childless. The baby that was born on screen, delivered by Peter Griffin himself, has vanished into thin air. It's not even that the child is explained away or written out. It's that the show acts like the child never existed in the first place. Fan theories about what happened to Carol's baby range from the mundane to the deeply disturbing. The most optimistic theory is that Carol simply has full-time childcare, and we never see her son, because he's always with a nanny or babysitter. This doesn't really work, though, because surely the child would be mentioned at least once. Surely Carol would reference being a mother, would talk about her son, would have some aspect of her character reflect this major life change. But there's nothing. Radio silence about this baby's existence. A darker theory suggests that Carol's ex-husband, the father of the baby, took custody, and the child lives with him full-time. This could explain why we never see the baby. Carol doesn't have custody. But this theory also falls apart under scrutiny. Would Carol really have zero visitation rights? Would she never mention her son even in passing? Would the show really establish that Peter delivered his nephew and then never reference this family member again? It seems unlikely that custody arrangements would be so complete that the baby ceases to exist in Carol's life entirely. Some fans have jokingly suggested that Carol put the baby up for adoption immediately after birth, which would technically explain the disappearance, but raises horrifying questions about why she'd do that. There's no evidence for this theory, and it seems way too dark, even for Family Guy. The show has done some questionable things over the years, but having a character give up a baby with no explanation or follow-up would be unusually cruel and pointless. The most realistic explanation is simply that the writers forgot. They did a birth episode for comedy, got their jokes out of Peter delivering a baby, and then moved on without thinking about the long-term continuity implications. This happens in television writing more often than you'd think, especially in comedies where continuity isn't the primary focus. Someone pitches a funny idea for an episode. Nobody thinks about how it affects future stories, and then you're stuck with a continuity problem that's easier to ignore than to fix. But here's what makes Carol's vanishing baby particularly egregious compared to other Family Guy plot holes. This isn't a small detail or a throwaway line that got contradicted later. This is a major life event that happened on screen and was then completely erased. Birth is one of the most significant moments in a person's life. Becoming a parent fundamentally changes who you are as a character. The show spent an entire episode focused on this baby being born, and then acted like it never happened. Compare this to how other shows handle similar situations. When a character has a baby on most sitcoms, that baby becomes part of the show's fabric. Maybe they're not in every scene, maybe they're not a major character, but they exist. They're acknowledged. The parent character's storylines reflect the fact that they now have a child. Family Guy has done this with other characters. When Joe and Bonnie finally had Susie, she became a recurring presence. When Lois was pregnant with Stewie in flashbacks, the show acknowledged it. But Carol's baby? Total erasure. What's especially frustrating is that the show could have fixed this plot hole pretty easily. They could have had a throwaway line in a later episode explaining what happened. Carol could mention that her ex got full custody, or that the baby lives with its father, or literally any explanation at all. It wouldn't even need to be a major plot point. Just one line of dialogue acknowledging that, yes, Carol had a baby, and here's why we don't see that baby anymore. But Family Guy never bothered to do even that much. The vanishing baby also creates weird implications for Peter's character. He delivered his nephew, had this bonding experience with Carol during this incredibly intimate moment, and then apparently never thinks about or mentions this nephew again. Peter has shown interest in his own children, despite being a terrible father. He has relationships with his extended family. But this nephew, the one whose birth he personally facilitated, might as well not exist as far as Peter is concerned. There's also the question of what this means for the Pewter-Schmidt family dynamics. Carter and Barbara, Carol's parents and the baby's grandparents, never mention having another grandchild. The wealthy Pewter-Schmidt family, who are obsessed with legacy and lineage, apparently have zero interest in this grandson. When Carter makes his various pronouncements about family and inheritance, he never includes Carol's son. It's like the baby isn't just missing from Carol's life, but from the entire family's awareness. Some fans have pointed out that this plot hole is actually worse than Bonnie's pregnancy situation. At least with Bonnie, the pregnancy was acknowledged, even if it lasted impossibly long. At least the show made jokes about the continuity error and eventually resolved it. But Carol's baby? Complete silence. The show doesn't joke about it, doesn't reference it, doesn't acknowledge that anything is amiss. It's a total memory hole. Orwellian levels of pretending something never happened. The most generous interpretation is that Family Guy exists in a loose continuity where major events can be canon in one episode and then ignored in all future episodes. The show has always had this approach to storytelling, where each episode is sort of its own thing, and you're not supposed to think too hard about how everything fits together. From this perspective, the birth episode happened in that episode's universe, but subsequent episodes exist in slightly different universes where the birth never occurred. This is basically the every episode is its own continuity theory of Family Guy, which does explain a lot of the show's plot holes, but also means that nothing matters, and there's no point in caring about any storyline. But even accepting that Family Guy plays fast and loose with continuity, Carol's disappearing baby stands out as especially egregious. This isn't a small detail that changed between episodes. This is a whole human being who was born and then erased from existence. It's one thing to have characters' backstories shift, or to have events be contradicted. It's another thing entirely to have a character give birth on screen and then act like that character was never a parent. Looking at this plot hole from a writing perspective, you have to wonder what happened in the writer's room. Did anyone point out that they were creating a continuity problem? Did anyone suggest following up on the baby in future episodes? Or was the attitude just that it was a one-off birth episode and they'd worry about continuity later? And when later came and they realized they'd forgotten about the baby, did anyone suggest addressing it? Or did they just hope viewers wouldn't notice or care? The sad thing is that Carol could have been a more interesting character if the show had committed to her being a mother. It would have given her more depth, more storylines, more reasons to appear in episodes. Instead, she remains a fairly one-note recurring character who shows up occasionally for family drama. The baby could have added dimension to her character, but because the show forgot about it, Carol stays relatively underdeveloped. What's truly baffling is that this plot hole has persisted for over 15 years now. The birth episode aired in 2006, and we're well into the 20s, and the show has never addressed what happened to Carol's baby. That's nearly 2 decades of pretending a major character event never happened. At this point, even if the show tried to explain it, the explanation would raise more questions than it answered. Where has this child been all this time? Why was he never mentioned? How do you retcon a baby back into existence after ignoring his existence for hundreds of episodes? Carol's vanishing baby represents one of the purest examples of Family Guy's approach to continuity. When something becomes inconvenient or complicated, just ignore it. Don't explain it. Don't justify it. Don't even acknowledge that there's anything to explain. Just move forward like it never happened and hope that everyone forgets or stops caring. For most plot holes, this approach sort of works because viewers are willing to overlook small inconsistencies for the sake of comedy. But when you're talking about a baby that was born on screen and then disappeared forever, just ignore it. Stops being a viable strategy and becomes a genuinely disturbing mystery. So what happened to Carol's baby? The honest answer is that nothing happened to him because the writers forgot he existed. He's trapped in continuity limbo, simultaneously born and never born, existing in one episode and erased from all others. He's Schrodinger's baby, both real and unreal depending on which episode you're watching. And that might be the most Family Guy thing possible, creating a plot hole so complete that a character's child simply stops existing because no one felt like writing stories about him. Now we need to talk about one of the most medically absurd plot holes in Family Guy history, and that's saying something for a show that regularly ignores basic biology, physics, and common sense. This is the episode where Stewie contracts herpes from Brian through a blood transfusion, which sounds bad enough on its own, but becomes truly baffling when you realize that's not how herpes works. At all. Even a little bit. This plot hole represents Family Guy's willingness to completely disregard medical reality for the sake of a joke, even when the joke fundamentally doesn't make sense. The episode in question is Herpes the Love Sore from Season 12, which aired in 2013. The setup is actually kind of sweet, in a twisted Family Guy way. Stewie needs a blood transfusion for reasons that aren't super important to this discussion, and Brian volunteers to donate blood because he and Stewie are best friends, and Brian wants to help save his life. They do this whole blood brother ceremony thing, where they mix their blood together, and it's played as this touching moment of friendship and loyalty. Brian is literally giving his blood to save Stewie's life. It should be a heartwarming scene. But then, Stewie wakes up after the transfusion, and something is wrong. He's got sores around his mouth. He's feeling sick. He goes to the doctor, and the diagnosis comes back. Herpes. Stewie has contracted herpes simplex virus, and he's understandably freaked out about it. He's a baby. Well, technically a 1-year-old genius, but still. He's got herpes now, and he needs to figure out where it came from. The episode plays this for comedy, with Stewie having to deal with the social stigma of having an STD and trying to figure out how a baby ended up with herpes. Eventually, Stewie confronts Brian, and Brian admits that yes, he has herpes, and yes, he knew he had herpes when he donated blood, and yes, he's very sorry that Stewie now has herpes too. This revelation is treated as a betrayal of trust. Brian knew he was infected and gave his blood to Stewie anyway, and now Stewie has to live with this permanent viral infection. The emotional beats of the episode are all about their friendship being damaged by Brian's dishonesty, and Stewie feeling violated by what happened. Here's the problem, and it's a big one. You cannot contract herpes through blood transfusion. It's medically impossible. Herpes simplex virus is not a blood-borne pathogen. It doesn't live in your bloodstream the way HIV or hepatitis does. Herpes is transmitted through direct contact with infected skin or mucous membranes, typically through kissing, sexual contact, or sharing items that touch the mouth like utensils or lip balm. The virus lives in nerve cells, not in blood cells. When you have a herpes outbreak, the virus travels along nerve pathways to the skin surface, where it causes sores, but it doesn't circulate through your bloodstream in any meaningful concentration. Medical professionals screen blood donations for various pathogens, but herpes isn't one of them. Precisely because herpes can't be transmitted through blood, the virus simply doesn't work that way. If someone with herpes donates blood, that blood is safe to use because the virus won't be present in the blood in a form that can cause infection. This is established medical science, not some obscure detail that you'd need a doctorate to know. This is basic information about how herpes transmission works. So the entire premise of the episode is based on something that's biologically impossible. Stewie could not have gotten herpes from Brian's blood transfusion, because that's not a transmission route for the herpes virus. The whole storyline falls apart under even basic medical scrutiny. It's like writing an episode where a character gets pregnant from a swimming pool. It's not how biology works. And anyone with basic sex education knowledge would spot the error immediately. But wait, it gets worse. The episode also features Brian giving herpes to Chris through another blood-related incident. Chris cuts himself. Brian licks the wound, which is already deeply weird and inappropriate. And then Chris develops herpes too. This one is at least theoretically possible since it involves direct contact with saliva, which can transmit oral herpes. But the episode doesn't make it clear whether Chris has oral herpes or genital herpes. And the distinction actually matters because they're caused by different strains of the virus and have different transmission patterns. The show seems to be treating herpes as this generic disease that can be spread through any bodily fluid contact, which is an oversimplification that borders on misinformation. Herpes is actually two different viruses, HSV1, which typically causes oral herpes, and HSV2, which typically causes genital herpes. They have different preferred locations in the body and different transmission patterns. The episode treats all herpes as the same thing and all transmission methods as equally viable, which they're not. What makes this plot hole particularly frustrating is that the episode could have worked with a different disease. If the writers wanted to do a story about Stewie contracting something from Brian's blood, they could have chosen a blood-borne pathogen. Hepatitis, for example, can absolutely be transmitted through blood transfusion. HIV could be transmitted that way, though that would be darker than even Family Guy usually goes. There are plenty of diseases that actually are transmitted through blood. The writers chose herpes specifically, probably because it has a social stigma that they could mine for jokes. But they chose a disease that doesn't work the way they needed it to work for their story. This creates a weird educational problem. Family Guy has a huge audience, including a lot of young people who might not have comprehensive health education. When the show presents medically inaccurate information about disease transmission, even in a comedy context, it can reinforce misconceptions. Someone watching this episode might come away thinking that herpes can be transmitted through blood, which is false, and that belief could affect how they think about blood donation, herpes risk, or disease transmission in general. Now, to be fair to Family Guy, the show is not a medical textbook and shouldn't be held to the standard of providing accurate health information. It's a comedy show that regularly features talking babies, time machines, and characters surviving injuries that would kill a real person instantly. Medical accuracy has never been a priority, but there's a difference between having unrealistic cartoon physics and presenting misinformation about disease transmission. One is harmless fantasy. The other potentially spreads misconceptions about real health issues. The episode also treats herpes with a level of stigma that's both outdated and kind of cruel. Herpes is incredibly common, with roughly 2/3 of the global population infected with HSV-1 and significant percentages infected with HSV-2. Most people with herpes have no symptoms or very mild symptoms. It's a manageable condition that doesn't significantly affect most people's quality of life. But the episode treats it like this devastating diagnosis that ruins Stewie's life and marks him as tainted. The jokes are all about how gross and shameful it is to have herpes, which reinforces negative stigma around a very common virus. From a character consistency standpoint, this episode also raises questions about Brian's medical knowledge. Brian is supposed to be the smart, educated member of the Griffin household. He reads, he writes, he considers himself intellectually superior to everyone around him. Would Brian really not know that herpes isn't transmitted through blood? Would he really donate blood while knowingly having an STD without checking whether that's safe? It seems out of character for Brian to be this ignorant about basic medical facts, unless we're supposed to believe he knew it was safe and lied to Stewie about transmitting the disease, which raises even darker questions about his motivations. The episode tries to have it both ways by treating the disease transmission as real within the show's universe, while also making jokes that suggest the writers know it's not realistic. There are meta moments where characters seem aware that something doesn't quite add up, but these moments don't clarify whether we're supposed to accept the medical impossibility as canon or see it as an acknowledged plot hole. This ambiguity is classic Family Guy, refusing to commit to either this is our reality or we know this is wrong, but we're doing it anyway. Fan reactions to this episode were mixed, with some people finding the herpes storyline funny and others pointing out the medical inaccuracies. Online discussions featured actual doctors and nurses explaining why the plot couldn't happen in real life, which is always a sign that your medical episode has missed the mark. Some fans defended the episode by saying Family Guy isn't meant to be realistic, which is true, but doesn't quite address why the writers chose to base an entire episode on impossible disease transmission when they could have chosen something that actually works the way they needed it to. The resolution of the episode has Stewie and Brian working through their friendship issues and accepting that they both have herpes now, which is supposed to be touching, but is undercut by the fact that the whole situation is medically impossible. It's hard to feel the emotional weight of their reconciliation when the entire conflict is based on a scenario that couldn't happen. It's like watching characters have a serious conversation about how to deal with the consequences of getting superpowers from a radioactive spider bite. Sure, it works as fiction, but the emotional stakes feel hollow because the premise is so divorced from reality. This plot hole also has implications for the show's universe more broadly. If herpes can be transmitted through blood in the Family Guy world, does that mean other diseases work differently too? Are all the rules of biology different in Quahog? Or is it just this one specific disease that behaves in a medically impossible way? The show doesn't answer these questions because it's not interested in establishing consistent rules for how disease works. Each episode exists in its own bubble where the rules are whatever serves that particular story. Looking at this from a writing perspective, you have to wonder what the research process was like, or if there even was one. Did anyone in the writer's room look up how herpes transmission works? Did anyone consult with a medical professional? Or did they just assume that herpes, like other diseases they'd heard of, could be transmitted through blood? It's possible the writers knew the science was wrong and didn't care because the joke was more important than accuracy. It's also possible they genuinely didn't know, and no one in the production process caught the error before it aired. The fact that this episode aired in 2013, well into the information age, when medical facts are easily accessible online, makes the error more puzzling. This isn't like an episode from the 1990s, where you'd have to go to a library to verify medical information. A quick Google search would have revealed that herpes isn't transmitted through blood. Someone in the production process could have caught this error at any stage, from the initial pitch to the script writing to the animation to the final review before airing. But apparently, no one did, or no one cared enough to change it. What's truly remarkable about this plot hole is how completely unnecessary it is. The episode could have achieved all its goals. The friendship conflict between Stewie and Brian, the jokes about dealing with an STD, the resolution where they work through their issues, with a disease that actually is bloodborne. The story doesn't require herpes specifically. Any transmissible disease would work, but the writers chose herpes, presumably because of the social stigma attached to it, and in doing so, created a plot hole that undermines the entire episode for anyone with basic medical knowledge. In the grand tradition of Family Guy plot holes, the herpes transmission error has never been addressed or corrected by the show. There's been no follow-up episode where someone points out that herpes doesn't work that way. No character has ever mentioned that maybe Stewie's diagnosis was wrong, or that the transmission method doesn't make sense. The show just moved on, and now this medically impossible event is part of the show's canon, such as it is. Stewie has herpes that he got from a blood transfusion, which is impossible, and we're all just supposed to accept it. So we're left with an episode that's built entirely on a medical impossibility, that spreads misinformation about disease transmission, that reinforces stigma around a common virus, and that creates continuity questions about how biology works in the Family Guy universe. It's a plot hole that didn't need to exist, that could have been avoided with minimal research or effort, and that makes the entire episode fall apart under scrutiny. And yet, it's there, permanent and unchangeable. Another example of Family Guy's commitment to telling whatever story seems funny in the moment, regardless of whether it makes any logical or scientific sense. Brian Griffin's atheism is one of his most defining character traits. Throughout the entire run of Family Guy, Brian has positioned himself as the rational, skeptical, intellectual voice who doesn't believe in God or religion. He's gotten into arguments with Meg about faith. He's mocked religious people. He's written essays about how religion is a crutch for the weak-minded. His atheism isn't just a casual belief. It's a core part of his identity as the enlightened liberal intellectual in a household full of idiots. There's just one massive problem with Brian's staunch atheism. He has personally met Jesus Christ, spoken with God face to face, witnessed undeniable miracles, and experienced the supernatural on multiple occasions. And yet, he still insists he's an atheist who needs evidence for the divine. This isn't a case of interpretation or ambiguity. We're not talking about vague religious experiences that could be explained away as hallucinations or dreams. We're talking about concrete, verifiable encounters with deities that happen in the show's reality and are witnessed by multiple characters. Brian has had conversations with Jesus. He's shaken God's hand. He's been to heaven and hell. He's seen angels, demons, and divine interventions. And through all of it, he maintains his position that there's no evidence for God's existence. It's like standing in the rain while insisting that weather doesn't exist. Let's start with one of the earliest and most blatant examples. In the Season 2 episode, If I'm Dying, I'm Lying, Peter claims that his son Chris was miraculously healed by God, which isn't true. It's just one of Peter's scams. But the lie spirals out of control, and Peter ends up starting a religion with himself as a prophet. Things go badly, as they always do with Peter, and he desperately needs an actual miracle to get himself out of trouble. So he prays to God, and here's where it gets interesting. Peter asks God to send him a new bike as proof of his existence, and God does. A bike literally appears out of nowhere, delivered by divine power, in front of Peter and Brian. Brian witnesses this miracle happen. He's standing right there when Peter prays, and the bike materializes. This isn't something Peter could have faked or staged. There's no rational explanation for how this bike appeared. It's a genuine, supernatural event that Brian personally observes. And his reaction? He's shocked for about 5 seconds, and then apparently just decides not to think about it too hard. In later episodes, he goes right back to saying there's no evidence for God's existence, as if he didn't watch physical matter appear from nothing in response to a prayer. But it gets so much worse. In the season 7 episode, I Dream of Jesus, the Griffin family goes to a record store. And who do they meet? Jesus Christ. Not someone claiming to be Jesus, not a Jesus impersonator, but the actual Son of God, complete with miracle-working powers. Jesus proves his identity by turning water into wine, healing the sick, and performing various other supernatural feats. Multiple people witness these miracles, including Brian. Jesus becomes a recurring presence in their lives for the duration of the episode, hanging out at the Griffin house, going to Peter's work, becoming a real person that everyone can see and interact with. Brian has extended conversations with Jesus in this episode. He's in the same room with the living embodiment of Christianity, watching him perform miracles that violate the laws of physics. Jesus isn't subtle about his divine nature. He's openly performing supernatural acts and talking about his relationship with God. This isn't a crisis of faith situation where Brian could reasonably doubt what he's seeing. This is unambiguous divine reality staring him in the face. And yet, in episodes after this, Brian continues to identify as an atheist and mock religious belief. The absurdity reaches its peak when we consider that Brian has actually met God himself, not once, but multiple times. In several episodes, God appears as a character, usually voiced by someone famous, and interacts directly with the Griffin family. In Family Guy, God shows up at the end to resolve the plot. In 3 Acts of God, which aired much later in the show's run, God is literally a main character who comes to Earth and gets involved in the Griffin family's problems. Brian has direct, face-to-face conversations with the creator of the universe. Think about what this means. Brian hasn't just seen evidence that could potentially be interpreted as divine intervention. He's shaken hands with God. He's had lunch with Jesus. He's witnessed miracles that have no scientific explanation. He's experienced things that completely validate every claim made by religious believers. He has better evidence for God's existence than virtually any religious person in human history. Moses saw a burning bush. Brian had dinner with the guy who created bushes. And it's not like these experiences are presented as dreams or hallucinations within the show's universe. Other characters see Jesus and God too. The events have real consequences that persist after the divine encounters end. These are real events happening in the show's reality, not drug-induced visions or wish fulfillment fantasies. The show treats these encounters as actually happening, not as ambiguous experiences that could be explained away. So how does Brian maintain his atheism? The only possible explanations are all deeply unsatisfying. One possibility is that Brian has some kind of cognitive dissonance so severe that he's able to completely compartmentalize his direct experiences with the divine and convince himself they didn't mean what they obviously meant. This would suggest Brian is fundamentally irrational and incapable of updating his beliefs based on evidence, which contradicts his entire identity as a logical, rational thinker. Another possibility is that Brian knows God exists, but continues to identify as an atheist anyway, either out of stubbornness or because his atheism is more about his self-image than actual belief. This interpretation makes Brian look even worse because it means he's being deliberately dishonest about his beliefs for the sake of appearing intellectual. He's the guy at a party who argues about philosophy while knowing his positions are factually wrong. The third possibility is the meta one. Family Guy doesn't care about continuity, and each episode exists in its own bubble where previous events don't matter. Brian is an atheist when the story needs him to be an atheist for a joke or conflict. And God exists when the story needs God to exist for a different joke or conflict. The writers aren't concerned with how these contradictory elements coexist because they're not trying to create a coherent universe. They're just trying to make each individual episode funny. This third explanation is probably the most accurate, but it doesn't make the plot hole any less jarring when you're watching the show. It's particularly noticeable because Brian's atheism comes up regularly. It's not a detail that's mentioned once and forgotten. Brian brings up his lack of religious belief frequently, gets into arguments about it, writes about it, makes it a core part of how he sees himself. So when he encounters undeniable evidence for the divine, and then continues to be an atheist, it's not just a contradiction. It's a fundamental break in his character logic. The show occasionally seems aware of this problem and makes jokes about it. There are moments where characters point out inconsistencies in Brian's beliefs, or where Brian's hypocrisy is highlighted for comedic effect. But these meta moments don't resolve the contradiction. They just acknowledge it exists. It's like the writers are saying, yes, we know this doesn't make sense, and we're doing it anyway. What makes this particularly frustrating is that Brian's atheism could work in the Family Guy universe if the show had made different choices. If divine beings never appeared directly, if religious elements were always ambiguous or explained away, then Brian's skepticism would be consistent. Or, if Brian adjusted his beliefs after encountering God and Jesus, admitting that, okay, there's clearly something supernatural going on here, his character would maintain internal consistency. But the show wants to have it both ways. It wants to do episodes with God and Jesus as characters, and it wants Brian to be an atheist, and it doesn't care that these two things are mutually exclusive. This contradiction extends to Brian's entire worldview, not just his atheism. Brian positions himself as someone who follows evidence and logic. He's supposedly the rational one, the one who bases his beliefs on what can be proven. But his insistence on atheism, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, reveals that he's actually the opposite of rational. He's clinging to a belief system in the face of contradictory evidence, which is exactly what he accuses religious people of doing. There's also something deeply ironic about Brian's situation. Religious faith is often defined as belief without proof, trusting in the divine despite lack of concrete evidence. Religious people through history have struggled with doubt, wondered if God is real, searched for signs and proof. Brian lives in a universe where proof is abundant and readily available, where God occasionally drops by for dinner, where Jesus is in the phone book. Brian has access to the kind of definitive proof that believers pray for. And he still doesn't believe. It's like someone standing in the middle of the ocean insisting that water doesn't exist. The fan theories trying to explain this plot hole are creative but ultimately unsatisfying. Some fans suggest that the God and Jesus who appear in Family Guy aren't actually divine beings, but some kind of powerful aliens, or interdimensional entities pretending to be deities. This theory requires a lot of assumptions that the show never supports, and doesn't explain how these beings can perform actual miracles that violate natural law. Other fans propose that Brian has such a commitment to atheism as part of his identity, that he's willing to deny reality itself to maintain it, which makes Brian look pathologically stubborn rather than rationally skeptical. The most generous interpretation is that Brian represents a certain type of atheist who's more committed to the aesthetic and social positioning of atheism than to the actual philosophical question of whether God exists. Brian likes being the atheist in the room. He likes feeling superior to religious people. He likes the identity of being the rational skeptic. His atheism is less about belief and more about ego. From this perspective, encountering God doesn't change his position because his position was never really about evidence in the first place. But even this interpretation has problems because Brian does frequently claim that his atheism is based on lack of evidence. He doesn't say, "I choose not to believe in God," or "I don't like the concept of God." He says there's no evidence for God's existence. And that statement is demonstrably false in the Family Guy universe. The evidence is overwhelming and personal. Brian has more evidence for God than he has for most things he believes without question. This plot hole also creates problems for other elements of the show's mythology. If God and Jesus are real and active in the world, what does that mean for other religious claims? Is Christianity specifically correct? Do heaven and hell exist as Christian theology describes them? The show has done episodes suggesting they do. So is Brian also denying the existence of an afterlife, despite having potentially visited it? How far does his denial of observable reality extend? What's especially notable about this plot hole is how unnecessary it is. The show could easily have Brian's atheism evolve after meeting God. He could become agnostic, or a reluctant believer, or someone who acknowledges that supernatural beings exist but questions their moral authority. This would be character development based on experiences, which is how character development is supposed to work. But Family Guy is allergic to permanent character development, so Brian remains frozen in his initial characterization even when it stops making sense. The show's treatment of religion is generally inconsistent anyway. Sometimes religious people are mocked as stupid and superstitious. Sometimes religion is treated as a genuine force for good. Sometimes divine intervention solves problems. Sometimes prayer is shown to be useless. The show takes whatever position on religion works for that particular episode's jokes. But Brian's atheism is supposed to be a consistent character trait, not something that shifts based on the needs of individual episodes. The fact that it contradicts the show's own events is a failure of character consistency. In later seasons, there are moments where Brian seems to acknowledge that God might exist, or where he's less strident in his atheism. But these moments are fleeting and never represent a real shift in his character. By the next episode, where his beliefs come up, he's back to being the same militant atheist, insisting there's no evidence for the divine while living in a universe where he's personally met Jesus multiple times. The Brian atheism plot hole represents everything that's frustrating about Family Guy's approach to continuity. It's not just that events are contradicted or forgotten. It's that a character's core trait is rendered logically impossible by the show's own content, and nobody seems to care. Brian can be an atheist, or God can be a recurring character, but both can't be true simultaneously in any coherent universe. Family Guy chose both, and the result is a character whose stated beliefs make no sense given his actual experiences. So we're left with Brian Griffin, the atheist who's met God, the skeptic who's witnessed miracles, the rational thinker who ignores overwhelming evidence that contradicts his beliefs. He's a walking contradiction, a character whose defining trait is impossible given the show's reality. And that, in a nutshell, is how Family Guy treats continuity. Every episode is whatever it needs to be. Previous events don't matter. And if a character's core identity becomes logically impossible, well, that's just part of the show's charm. Brian will continue being an atheist, no matter how many times Jesus comes over for dinner, because that's what the character is supposed to be. Evidence be damned. Literally. One of the most mathematically impossible relationships in Family Guy involves Brian and his son, Dylan, a character who appears in a handful of episodes and creates a timeline paradox so severe that the show itself eventually acknowledges it's completely absurd. This is a plot hole that involves basic arithmetic, dog years versus human years, and the simple biological fact that children cannot be older than their parents. And yet, somehow, Family Guy managed to create exactly that situation, giving Brian a son who is chronologically older than Brian himself could possibly be. Let's establish the basic facts about Brian's age first. Brian is a dog, and throughout the series, it's been established that he's around 7 or 8 years old in dog years. The show has been somewhat inconsistent about his exact age, but the general consensus is that he's a young adult dog, probably somewhere in that 7 to 8 year range. Now, If you want to convert that to human years using the traditional calculation, which is completely made up but we'll go with it anyway, you multiply by 7, which would make Brian roughly 49 to 56 in equivalent human maturity. But that's not really how the show treats Brian's age. He's presented as being roughly in his early to mid-30s in terms of human maturity and life experience. The show has played with this dog years concept multiple times. In some episodes, Brian is treated as being younger than the adult humans around him. In others, he seems to be roughly the same age as Peter and Lois in terms of maturity and life stage. The exact numbers don't really matter for most storylines because Brian is essentially written as a human character who happens to be a dog. His age is whatever the plot needs it to be in any given episode. That's frustrating from a continuity standpoint, but it's manageable. Where things completely fall apart is when we meet Dylan. Dylan first appears in the Season 5 episode, The Former Life of Brian, which aired in 2006. We learn that Brian has a son from a previous relationship, a human son, which raises immediate questions about the biology of this universe that we're probably better off not thinking about too hard. Dylan is introduced as a teenager, clearly going through that awkward adolescent phase. He's rebellious. He's got attitude. He's dealing with typical teenage problems. The episode treats him as being around 13 or 14 years old, based on his appearance, behavior, and the life stage he's in. Here's where the math becomes a problem. If Dylan is 13 years old, that means he was conceived 13 years ago from the show's present-day timeline, give or take 9 months for pregnancy. But Brian is only 7 or 8 years old. Brian literally did not exist 13 years ago. He had not been born yet. Even if we're extremely generous with the timeline and say that Brian is 8 years old and Dylan is on the younger end of teenage years, say 12, the numbers still don't work. Brian would have had to father a child when he was negative 5 years old. That's not just biologically impossible. That's mathematically impossible. You cannot be a parent before you exist. Now, maybe you're thinking that we should use dog years for this calculation. Maybe Brian is 8 years old in dog years, which would be 56 in human equivalent years, which would be plenty old enough to have a teenage son. But the show explicitly establishes that Brian ages at a dog's rate, not a human's rate. In multiple episodes, we see Brian's birthday, and he ages 1 year at a time just like any other dog would. He's not aging 7 years every birthday. When the show says Brian is 7 or 8 years old, they mean he's actually been alive for 7 or 8 years, not 7 or 8 dog years that translate to 50-something human years. Furthermore, Dylan ages normally like a human. He's not aging in dog years. Between his appearances in different episodes, time passes, and Dylan gets older at a human rate. So we've got Brian aging at dog speed, Dylan aging at human speed, and somehow Dylan is older than Brian, despite Brian being his father. The timeline is completely broken. The show seems vaguely aware that this is a problem. In Dylan's second appearance in Season 8's The Juice is Loose, there's a moment where the characters almost acknowledge the age issue, but then quickly move past it. It's like the writers knew they'd created an impossible situation, but didn't want to deal with it directly. Instead, they just hoped viewers would be distracted by the emotional storylines and not think too hard about the chronology. And the emotional storylines are interesting, which makes this plot hole even more frustrating. Dylan's episodes are actually pretty good by Family Guy standards. They deal with Brian trying to connect with his estranged son, Dylan's resentment toward his absent father, and their attempts to build a relationship despite years of separation. These are compelling character stories that give Brian depth and explore his flaws and failures. But they're all built on a foundation of temporal impossibility. The emotional weight of Brian missing his son's childhood doesn't really land when you remember that Brian wasn't alive for most of his son's childhood. Let's try to reverse engineer a timeline that makes this work, just to see how impossible it really is. For Dylan to be 13 years old in the episode where he first appears, which aired in 2006, he would have been born around 1993. Assuming the show's timeline roughly matches the real-world timeline, which it sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. For Brian to have fathered Dylan, Brian would need to have been alive and sexually mature in 1993. But Family Guy premiered in 1999, and Brian was already established as an adult dog at that point, meaning he was probably born around 1992 or 1991 at the earliest. So Brian was either not born yet when Dylan was conceived, or was a puppy, which creates even more disturbing implications. Some fans have tried to argue that maybe the Family Guy timeline doesn't match real-world time, that maybe decades have passed within the show's universe, even though the characters don't age. But this doesn't work either, because the show regularly references current events, recent presidents, contemporary pop culture. The show exists in a floating timeline where it's always roughly the current year, which means we can't just add decades of off-screen time to make Brian old enough to have a teenage son. Other fans have suggested that maybe Brian ages faster than normal dogs, or that he's somehow older than he appears, or that Dylan is actually younger than he looks. But none of these explanations are supported by the show. Brian's age is mentioned multiple times across different episodes, and he's consistently portrayed as a young adult dog. Dylan is clearly a teenager, not a child who looks older. There's no evidence for any of these alternative explanations. They're just desperate attempts by fans to make the impossible timeline make sense. The most telling moment comes in Dylan's second appearance, when Brian himself seems confused about the timeline. There's a line where Brian references how long it's been since he saw Dylan, and the math just doesn't add up with Brian's established age. It's like the writers forgot how old they'd made Brian, or forgot how old they'd made Dylan, or just didn't care about making the numbers work. Given Family Guy's track record with continuity, that last option seems most likely. What makes this particularly absurd is that this plot hole was completely avoidable. The writers could have made Dylan younger, like 5 or 6 years old, which would fit within Brian's timeline. Or they could have established that Brian is older than previously suggested. Or they could have made Dylan a puppy, Brian's actual dog son, instead of somehow being a human teenager. Any of these solutions would have prevented the timeline paradox. But instead, they created a character who is chronologically impossible, and then brought that character back for multiple episodes, cementing the impossibility into the show's canon. There's also the question of Tracy, Dylan's mother and Brian's ex-girlfriend. How old is she? If she had Dylan 13 years ago, she's at least in her 30s, probably her mid-30s minimum. But when did she and Brian date? If Brian is only 8 years old, then their relationship happened relatively recently in Brian's life, maybe 3 or 4 years ago at most, based on how the show presents it. So Tracy was in her late 20s or early 30s when she dated Brian, who was a 4 or 5-year-old dog. Even by Family Guy's loose standards, this raises uncomfortable questions. The show tries to play Brian's relationships with human women as if he's a human man, not a dog. His romantic storylines are written the same way you'd write them for any male character. But Dylan's existence forces us to confront the fact that Brian is actually a dog who ages at a dog's rate. And that creates massive problems for any relationship he's had with a human that's supposed to have happened more than a few years ago. Dylan's storyline also includes a redemption arc where he goes from resenting Brian to accepting him as his father and trying to build a relationship. This is presented as taking months or even years of effort. But during that time, Brian is aging. In the time it takes for Dylan to go from angry teenager to somewhat accepting teenager, Brian is getting proportionally much older because he's a dog. The math just doesn't work no matter how you approach it. In what might be the most meta moment in all of Family Guy, there's a scene in one of the later episodes where a character seems about to point out the age discrepancy, and Brian cuts them off and tells them to go complain on the internet. This is the show's way of acknowledging that yes, this makes no sense. Yes, they know it makes no sense. And no, they're not going to explain it or fix it. Just accept the plot hole and move on. It's the same defense mechanism the show uses for many of its continuity errors. Acknowledge the problem exists. make a joke about it, and then never actually resolve it. What's frustrating is that Dylan is actually a good character who adds interesting dimensions to Brian's backstory. The idea of Brian being an absent father who has to confront his failures and try to do better is compelling. The episodes dealing with Brian and Dylan's relationship are generally well written and emotionally resonant, but all of that is built on a foundation that makes no logical sense. It's like building a beautiful house on quicksand. The structure might be sound, but the foundation guarantees eventual collapse. After his initial appearances, Dylan largely disappears from the show. He's mentioned occasionally, but rarely appears, and eventually, he seems to be written out of continuity entirely. Maybe the writers realized the timeline was too broken to sustain. Maybe they just ran out of stories to tell with the character. Either way, Dylan joins the long list of Family Guy characters who appear for a few episodes, create massive continuity problems, and then vanish into the void of forgotten plot lines. The Dylan situation also raises questions about Brian's other relationships and whether they make temporal sense. How many other impossible children does Brian have? Are there other plot holes waiting to be discovered in his past relationships? The fact that one of his sons breaks the space-time continuum suggests we should be skeptical about all of Brian's backstory. From a writing perspective, the Dylan plot hole represents a fundamental failure of planning. When you introduce a character who's the child of an existing character, one of your first questions should be, does the math work? Is the parent character old enough to have a child this age? Does the timeline make sense? These are basic questions that should be answered before the script is even finished, let alone before the episode airs. The fact that Dylan made it through the entire production process without anyone catching the age problem suggests nobody was checking these details. Or maybe someone did catch it and decided it didn't matter. Maybe a writer or producer pointed out that the ages don't work, and the response was, who cares? It's funny. That would be very on brand for Family Guy, where comedy always takes precedence over logic or consistency. If a story is funny enough, it doesn't matter if it makes sense. The jokes matter more than the continuity. But here's the thing. The Dylan episodes aren't really dependent on the specific ages involved. The story of Brian trying to connect with his estranged son would work just as well if Dylan was 6 years old instead of 13. The emotional beats would be the same. The character conflicts would be the same. Even most of the jokes would probably still work. Making Dylan a teenager instead of a child didn't make the episode funnier or more interesting. It just made the timeline impossible. So we're left with Dylan, Brian's teenage son, who is somehow older than Brian himself, a character who cannot exist in any universe that follows basic rules of time and biology. He's a walking temporal paradox, a character whose very existence proves that Family Guy's continuity is completely broken. And like so many Family Guy plot holes, this one is never explained, never fixed, and eventually never mentioned. Dylan just fades away, leaving behind only the mathematical impossibility of his existence and a bunch of confused fans trying to make the timeline work when it simply can't. Brian's impossible son stands as a testament to Family Guy's approach to storytelling. If it's funny in the moment, do it, and worry about whether it makes sense, never. Dylan is older than his father because the writers wanted him to be a teenager, and they weren't going to let something as trivial as the laws of time stop them. In the Family Guy universe, apparently, you can be your own grandfather. You can give birth before being born, and you can have a son who's older than you. Time is meaningless. Causality is a suggestion, and continuity is for cowards. That's just how Quahog works. Glenn Quagmire is one of Family Guy's most recognizable characters. The sex-obsessed pilot who lives next door to the Griffins and says giggity in response to anything remotely sexual. He's presented throughout the show as being roughly the same age as Peter, maybe a bit older, somewhere in his 40s or early 50s based on his appearance, energy level, and the way other characters treat him. He's a middle-aged guy with an active social life, a career as a commercial pilot, and apparently an inexhaustible libido. Except there's one major problem with this characterization. According to his driver's license, which appears on screen in one episode, Quagmire was born in 1948, which would make him 61 years old when that episode aired in 2009. 61. And that creates a cascade of timeline problems that make absolutely no sense, no matter how you try to rationalize them. The episode where we see Quagmire's birth date is Foxy Lady from Season 7. In this episode, there's a scene where Quagmire's driver's license is shown on screen, and eagle-eyed viewers notice the birth date listed, 1948. Now maybe the animators just threw a random year on there without thinking about the implications. Maybe it was supposed to be a throwaway visual gag that nobody would pay attention to. But viewers did pay attention, and they did the math. And suddenly, one of the show's core characters was apparently 20 years older than he'd always seemed to be. If Quagmire was born in 1948, and the show takes place roughly in the present day, which it generally does, since Family Guy regularly references current events and pop culture, then Quagmire is in his 60s, possibly even his 70s now, depending on which season you're watching. He's not a middle-aged swinger. He's a senior citizen with a disturbingly active sex life. He's not Peter's contemporary. He's old enough to be Peter's father. In fact, if Peter is around 43 years old, which has been stated in the show, and Quagmire was born in 1948, then Quagmire was 25 years old when Peter was born. He could literally be Peter's father from a biological age standpoint. But the problems go much deeper than just Quagmire being older than he looks. In the Season 8 episode, Quagmire's Dad, we meet Quagmire's father, who is revealed to be transgender and transitions to become Ida. The episode establishes that Quagmire's father served in the military, had a traditional masculine career, and lived as a man for decades before transitioning later in life. If Quagmire was born in 1948, then Ida would have been at least 20 years old in 1948, probably older, which means Ida was born around 1928 or earlier. That would make Ida over 80 years old during the events of that episode, possibly over 90. But Ida is presented as being in her 60s, maybe 70s at most. She's active, she's social, she's not portrayed as being in her 90s. The timeline gets even more confused when you consider Quagmire's military service. In multiple episodes, it's mentioned that Quagmire served in the Navy. There are references to his time in the service, photos of him in uniform, stories about his military experiences. If Quagmire was born in 1948, he would have been 18 years old in 1966, right in the middle of the Vietnam War. So, presumably, Quagmire is a Vietnam veteran, which would make sense for someone in their 60s. But the way the show presents Quagmire's military service doesn't quite match up with Vietnam-era service. The references are vague and don't really commit to a specific era or conflict. It's like the writers want Quagmire to have military experience, but don't want to pin down when that experience happened. There's also an episode, The Giggity Wife from Season 11, where Quagmire is shown trying to rent a car, and there's a discussion about his age in relation to car rental policies. The episode makes a joke about Quagmire being old enough to rent without restrictions, which would make sense if he's 61. But the way the joke is delivered suggests this is barely true, like he's just crossed that threshold. If Quagmire is really in his 60s, this joke doesn't quite land the way it's supposed to. He'd have been old enough to rent cars without age surcharges for decades. What really breaks the timeline is trying to reconcile Quagmire's birth date with the show's floating timeline. Family Guy exists in a perpetual present where characters don't age, and the current year is always roughly the year the episode airs. So an episode from 2009 takes place in 2009, an episode from 2020 takes place in 2020, and so on. But if Quagmire was born in 1948, then he's getting older as real-world time passes. By the time we get to episodes airing in 2023, Quagmire would be 75 years old. 75. This is a man who's still portrayed as being physically active, working as a commercial pilot, which has mandatory retirement ages, and maintaining his lifestyle of constant sexual conquest. It's not impossible for a 75-year-old to be active and healthy, but the way Quagmire is written doesn't reflect that age at all. Let's talk about the pilot career specifically, because this creates its own set of problems. Commercial airline pilots in the United States face mandatory retirement at age 65. That's a federal regulation. If Quagmire was born in 1948, he would have hit mandatory retirement in 2013. He should not be working as a pilot in any episode that takes place after 2013, which is most of the show's recent seasons. Now, maybe Quagmire is a private pilot, or flies charter planes, or works for a small operation that doesn't fall under the same regulations. But the show presents him as a commercial airline pilot, the kind that would absolutely be subject to mandatory retirement ages. So either Quagmire's birth date is wrong, or he's been illegally flying commercial planes for over a decade. There's also the question of how Quagmire maintains his lifestyle. The character is presented as having an extremely active sex life, to the point where it's his defining trait. Every conversation eventually becomes sexual. Every situation is an opportunity for innuendo, and he's constantly pursuing women. This characterization makes sense for a middle-aged man with too much free time and questionable morals. It makes significantly less sense for someone in their 70s. Again, it's not that older people can't have active sex lives, but the specific way Quagmire's sexuality is portrayed, aggressive, relentless, physically demanding, doesn't really match up with someone who's pushing 80. The drinking age episode creates another timeline problem. In the season 9 episode Baby You Knock Me Out, there's a scene at a bar where Quagmire is drinking, and there's some discussion about drinking ages and who's old enough to be in a bar. If Quagmire was born in 1948, he would have been 21 years old in 1969. He's been legal drinking age for over 40 years by the time this episode takes place. Any joke about Quagmire's age in relation to drinking makes no sense if he's actually in his 60s. He's one of the oldest people in any room he walks into. Fan theories about Quagmire's age have gotten creative, but none of them really solve the problem. Some fans suggest that maybe Quagmire uses some kind of dark magic or made a deal with the devil to stay young. The show has established that supernatural elements exist in the Family Guy universe, so this isn't completely implausible. Maybe Quagmire sold his soul for eternal youth, or found a fountain of youth, or made some kind of pact with dark forces. This theory has the advantage of potentially explaining why Quagmire looks and acts much younger than his chronological age, but the show has never hinted at anything like this. There's no episode where Quagmire's youth is presented as unnatural, or where he's shown using supernatural means to maintain his appearance. Other fans have proposed that maybe the 1948 birth date was a mistake by the animation team and isn't actually canon. This is probably the most likely explanation from a production standpoint. Someone needed to put a birth date on the driver's license, grabbed a random year without thinking about the implications, and accidentally made Quagmire 2 decades older than he's supposed to be. But the problem with this explanation is that the birth date appeared on screen in an aired episode. It's out there in the world, and the show has never corrected it or contradicted it with a different birth date. So even if it was a mistake, it's now part of the show's canon until proven otherwise. There's also the theory that maybe time works differently in Quahog, that the 1948 birth date doesn't mean Quagmire is actually 60 plus years old, because years pass differently in the Family Guy universe. But this doesn't hold up, because the show regularly references real-world events that happened in specific years. When characters talk about the past, they're talking about the actual historical past, not some alternate timeline. The show has episodes set in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, and those episodes present time as flowing normally. There's no evidence that Quahog operates on a different calendar, or that years are longer or shorter there. Some fans have tried to reconcile the age by suggesting that maybe Quagmire is just extremely well preserved, and that's part of his character. Maybe he takes exceptional care of himself, has great genetics, uses advanced skincare and fitness routines, and that's why he looks 45 when he's actually 65 or older. This is more plausible than the supernatural theories, but it still doesn't explain why nobody in the show treats him as being significantly older than Peter and the other guys. If Quagmire is 20 years older than his friend group, that would come up in conversation. People would reference the age gap. Jokes would be made about Quagmire being the old guy in the group. But none of that happens because the show doesn't treat Quagmire as being older than everyone else. The Ida transition timeline makes everything even more complicated. If we accept that Quagmire was born in 1948 and Ida transitioned in the episode Quagmire's Dad, which aired in 2009, then Ida would have transitioned at around 80 years old, assuming she was in her 20s when Quagmire was born. Transitioning later in life is certainly possible and does happen, but the Shonso episode presents Ida as having just recently transitioned, like this is a new development in her life. The emotional dynamics of the episode don't quite match up with someone transitioning in their 80s after living as a man for 6 decades. It feels more like someone transitioning in their 60s or early 70s, which would require Ida to be younger, which would require Quagmire to be younger. There's a recurring theme in Family Guy where the characters' ages and the timeline don't quite work, and Quagmire's birth date is one of the most extreme examples. The show wants Quagmire to be a contemporary of Peter, roughly the same age give or take a few years. But they also put 1948 on his driver's license, creating a 20-year age gap that the show never acknowledges. It's a classic case of the writers or animators not thinking through the implications of a detail they included. What makes this particularly frustrating is that Quagmire's age could have been anything. The driver's license could have shown any birth date. They could have put 1968, which would make Quagmire early 40s in the 2009 episode, which fits how he's portrayed. They could have put 1960, making him late 40s, still consistent with his characterization. But they put 1948, creating an impossible timeline that contradicts everything we know about the character. And once it's on screen in an aired episode, it becomes part of the canon, at least until the show explicitly contradicts it. The show has never addressed this contradiction directly. There's no episode where someone discovers Quagmire's real age and is shocked by it. There's no revelation that Quagmire has been lying about his age or that he's older than he appears. The 1948 birth date just exists, hanging out there in continuity, creating problems that the show has no interest in solving. It's Schrodinger's birth date, both canon and not canon simultaneously, depending on whether it's convenient to acknowledge it. In more recent seasons, the show seems to have quietly retconned Quagmire's age, or at least stopped acknowledging the 1948 birth date. Episodes that deal with age or birthdays don't present Quagmire as being in his 70s. He's treated as being middle-aged, probably in his 40s or early 50s, consistent with how he's always been portrayed. The driver's license birth date has become one of those details that fans remember and talk about, but the show itself has decided to ignore. This is actually a common pattern with Family Guy plot holes. The show will introduce some detail or plot point that creates a continuity problem. Fans will notice and discuss it extensively, and then the show will just pretend it never happened and move on. There's no official retcon, no in-universe explanation, just quiet abandonment of the problematic element. It's the TV equivalent of new phone who dis when confronted with past mistakes. The Quagmire age situation also highlights how little planning goes into maintaining Family Guy's continuity. Details get thrown into episodes without anyone checking whether they contradict established information or create timeline problems. And because Family Guy is an episodic comedy where each episode largely stands alone, these continuity errors don't immediately affect the viewing experience. You can watch most episodes without knowing Quagmire's birth date, and everything makes sense. It's only when you try to piece together the show's timeline or reconcile details across multiple episodes that you realize nothing adds up. So, what's the truth about Quagmire's age? Is he in his 40s like he appears to be? Or is he in his 70s like his driver's license suggests? The unsatisfying answer is that it depends on which element of the show you choose to accept as canon. If you go by the driver's license, Quagmire is pushing 80. If you go by literally everything else about how the character is written and portrayed, he's in his mid-40s. Both can't be true simultaneously, but Family Guy doesn't care about that. The show will continue presenting Quagmire as middle-aged, while that 1948 birth date sits in the canon, never acknowledged, never explained, never resolved. Quagmire's impossible age joins the long list of Family Guy timeline problems that make no sense mathematically. Like Brian's son being older than Brian, like Bonnie's decade-long pregnancy, Quagmire's birth date represents the show's fundamental disregard for consistent characterization and coherent timelines. The math doesn't work. The biology doesn't work. The logic doesn't work. But the jokes work. And for Family Guy, that's all that matters. Quagmire will continue saying giggity and pursuing women and flying planes well past mandatory retirement age, because the alternative would be addressing a plot hole that the show has no interest in fixing. And honestly, that's very on brand for a show that treats continuity as a suggestion rather than a rule. Giggity. The Griffin family tree is less a tree and more a tangled mess of contradictions, retcons, and biologically impossible relationships. At the center of this genealogical nightmare is Peter Griffin himself, whose parentage has been rewritten so many times that it's genuinely unclear who his father actually is, where his family comes from, or how any of the genetic inheritance makes sense. We're talking about a family history that's been contradicted by the show's own flashbacks, undermined by its own revelations, and confused by the fact that multiple Griffin ancestors look identical to Peter, despite supposedly coming from completely different genetic lines. It's a family tree that collapses under its own weight the moment you try to trace any branch. For the first 5 seasons of Family Guy, Peter's father figure was Francis Griffin, the strict, religious Irish Catholic man who made Peter's childhood miserable with his judgmental attitude and emotional abuse. Francis was presented as Peter's biological father, the man who raised him, whose genes he inherited, whose family history became Peter's family history. The show did multiple episodes about their dysfunctional relationship, showing Francis's disappointment in Peter and Peter's attempts to earn his father's approval. It was established canon that Francis Griffin was Peter's dad, full stop. Then came season 5's The Courtship of Stewie's Father, and everything changed. In this episode, Peter discovers through genetic testing that Francis is not his biological father. The revelation comes as a shock to Peter, who has to grapple with the fact that his entire understanding of his identity and heritage was based on a lie. The episode reveals that Peter's real biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish immigrant who had an affair with Peter's mother, Thelma. So Peter isn't Francis's son at all. He's Mickey's son. His entire genetic heritage comes from Mickey, not Francis. This is a huge revelation that fundamentally changes Peter's family history. Except it doesn't really change anything, because the show immediately forgets about it. After the big revelation episode, Mickey appears in maybe 1 or 2 more episodes and then basically vanishes from the show. Peter doesn't develop a relationship with his biological father. He doesn't explore his real genetic heritage. He doesn't deal with the implications of learning that everything he knew about his ancestry was wrong. The show just moves on, and Francis continues to be referenced as Peter's father in later episodes, even though we now know he isn't. It's like the Mickey revelation was erased from continuity. But the family tree problems don't stop there. They actually get much worse when you start looking at Peter's ancestors. In the season 4 episode, Untitled Griffin Family History, Peter tells his family about his ancestors, and we get flashbacks to various Griffin family members throughout history. One of these ancestors is Nate Griffin, who lived in the 1700s as a slave in the pre-Civil War South. And here's the thing about Nate Griffin. He looks exactly like Peter. Not just similar, not vaguely related looking, but identical. Same face, same body type, same voice, same mannerisms. Nate is presented as being Peter's direct ancestor, implying that the Griffin family line has maintained this specific appearance across centuries. But if Mickey McFinnigan is Peter's biological father, then Peter's genetics come from Mickey's family line, not Francis Griffin's family line. Nate Griffin would be Francis's ancestor, not Peter's ancestor. Peter shouldn't look anything like Nate because they don't share DNA. The fact that Peter is identical to Nate Griffin suggests that Peter is genetically connected to the Griffin family line, which contradicts the reveal that Francis isn't his biological father. Unless we're supposed to believe that Mickey McFinnigan's family happens to produce people who look exactly like this Griffin family, which would be an absurd coincidence. Then there's Black Knight Griffin, another ancestor shown in the same episode, a medieval knight who also looks exactly like Peter, and Big Pete Griffin, and basically every male ancestor in the Griffin family line going back generations. They all have Peter's appearance, Peter's voice, Peter's personality traits. The show is very clearly establishing that there's a genetic template that runs through the Griffin family, creating identical-looking men across centuries. But this only makes sense if Peter is actually part of the Griffin genetic line, which he supposedly isn't after the Mickey revelation. The problems multiply when we meet other Griffin family members. In various episodes, we encounter Peter's extended family on Francis's side, and many of them share Peter's physical characteristics. His cousin Karen Griffin, who appears in later seasons, looks like a female version of Peter. Various other Griffin relatives have the same basic body type, facial structure, and mannerisms. The implication is clear. The Griffin family has strong genetic traits that pass down through generations. But again, if Peter isn't genetically a Griffin, why does he look like all the other Griffins? There's also the matter of Peter's brother Chip, Francis's other son, who doesn't look anything like Peter. Chip is thin and looks completely different, which makes sense if he's Francis's biological son and Peter isn't. But this creates its own problem, because it means Francis's actual genetic offspring don't carry the Griffin family appearance, while Peter, who isn't Francis's biological son, does carry that appearance. So where did Peter get the Griffin look from? Not from Mickey, presumably. The show never suggests that Mickey looks like a Griffin. So Peter somehow spontaneously developed the exact appearance of a family he's not genetically related to. Let's try to trace Peter's actual genetic lineage based on what the show tells us. Peter's mother is Thelma Griffin, who had an affair with Mickey McFinnigan. So Peter is half Thelma and half Mickey genetically. Thelma is Irish and Mickey is Irish, so Peter is fully Irish from a genetic standpoint. But the show has also established that Peter has ancestors from various other backgrounds. There's Nate Griffin, who is black, suggesting African ancestry in the Griffin line. There are various English and European ancestors shown in flashbacks. Peter's genetic heritage should be a mix of whatever Thelma and Mickey's backgrounds are, but instead, he seems to have inherited genetic traits from the Griffin family line that he's not actually part of. The Mickey revelation also raises questions about Peter's upbringing and why Thelma and Francis stayed together. Francis is established as being extremely religious and traditional, the kind of man who would probably not forgive his wife for having an affair and passing off another man's child as his own. Yet Francis raised Peter as his son, albeit an unworthy son he was constantly disappointed in, for Peter's entire childhood. Did Francis know Peter wasn't his biological child? If he knew, why did he stay? If he didn't know, when did he find out? The show never addresses any of this. There's also the question of when Thelma's affair with Mickey happened. For the timeline to work, Mickey and Thelma must have had their affair shortly before Peter's birth, probably within a year of Peter being born. But the show presents Mickey as a figure from Thelma's past, someone from before she married Francis. If that's the case, then the timeline doesn't work unless Thelma had a relationship with Mickey, then married Francis, then immediately had an affair with Mickey again, then got pregnant with Peter. It's not impossible, but it's convoluted, and the show doesn't explain it clearly. Peter's mother Thelma dies relatively early in the show's run, and after her death, there are episodes that show flashbacks to Peter's childhood with both Thelma and Francis. In these flashbacks, Francis is still presented as Peter's father in every meaningful way. He's the dad at the dinner table, the authority figure, the man whose approval Peter seeks. The Mickey revelation doesn't retroactively change these flashbacks or add new context to them. They're presented the same way they always were, as if the Mickey revelation never happened. What makes this family tree situation particularly messy is that Family Guy loves doing historical flashbacks, where we see the Griffin ancestors, and these ancestors are always played by the same voice actors and look like variations of the main characters. So Peter's ancestors look like Peter, Lois's ancestors look like Lois, and so on. This is a common sitcom convention, a way to do historical episodes without introducing dozens of new characters. But when you combine this convention with the revelation that Peter isn't actually genetically a Griffin, it creates massive continuity problems. The show seems to want to have it both ways. It wants the dramatic revelation that Francis isn't Peter's real father, which creates interesting character conflict and emotional storylines. But it also wants to keep doing flashback episodes where Griffin ancestors look like Peter, because that's fun and allows the main voice actors to play historical characters. These two goals are fundamentally incompatible. Either Peter is genetically a Griffin and Francis is his father, or Peter isn't genetically a Griffin and all those ancestors have nothing to do with him. But the show tries to maintain both positions simultaneously. Fan theories have attempted to reconcile this mess, but none of them really work. Some fans suggest that maybe Mickey McFinnigan is secretly related to the Griffin family, that he's a distant cousin or something, which would explain why Peter has Griffin genetic traits, despite Mickey being his father. But the show never suggests this, and it would be enormous coincidence. Other fans propose that maybe the historical flashbacks aren't meant to be taken literally, that they're just Peter's imaginative interpretations of history, where he pictures his ancestors looking like him. This theory has the advantage of explaining the continuity errors, but it undermines the entire purpose of those episodes. There's also the theory that the show just retconned the Mickey revelation, and we're supposed to forget it happened. This is probably the most accurate explanation. The writers did an episode about Peter discovering his real father, got some good storylines out of it, and then quietly dropped it from continuity, because it was inconvenient for future stories. This is very typical of Family Guy's approach to continuity. Make a big change, use it for one episode or story arc, then pretend it never happened, and go back to the status quo. But even if we accept that the Mickey storyline has been quietly retconned, that doesn't fix all the problems with Peter's family tree. There are still continuity issues with the various ancestors and how they relate to each other. Nate Griffin is black, suggesting African heritage in the Griffin line, but other Griffin ancestors are white Europeans. How does this genetic inheritance work? Is the Griffin line meant to be ethnically diverse across generations? That's fine, but it's never explained. We just see different ancestors with different ethnic backgrounds, all of whom somehow produce descendants who look like Peter. The show's floating timeline makes the family tree even more confusing. Characters don't age, and the present day is always roughly the current year. But that means Peter's childhood, which is shown in flashbacks, is also floating. In early seasons, Peter's childhood was in the 1960s and 70s. In later seasons, his childhood seems to be in the 1970s and 80s. This shifts when Francis and Thelma were born, when they met, when they got married, and when Thelma's affair with Mickey happened. The entire family timeline is sliding forward through history, making it impossible to establish firm dates for any of these events. What's especially frustrating about Peter's parentage plot hole is that it affects so many other aspects of the show. Peter's Irish Catholic identity, which is a recurring element of his character, comes from being raised by Francis in an Irish Catholic household. But if Francis isn't his biological father, and Mickey is, then Peter's Irish heritage is still intact, but comes from a different source. Except the show never really explores what Peter's heritage is through Mickey. We don't meet Mickey's extended family, don't learn about Mickey's background in any detail, don't see how Peter's genetics through Mickey compare to his genetics through the Griffin line he's not actually part of. The show also does episodes about family medical history, genetic disorders, and inherited traits. In these episodes, characters talk about what runs in the Griffin family, what Peter inherited from Francis, what genetic risks his children might have. All of these conversations are based on the assumption that Peter is genetically a Griffin, which he isn't. Does Peter actually have the same medical risks as Francis's genetic offspring? Does he share genetic traits with Francis's extended family? The show treats him as if he does, ignoring the Mickey revelation entirely. There's even an episode where Peter and Lois discuss their children's genetic inheritance, talking about what traits came from Peter's side versus Lois's side. But if Peter's genetics come from Mickey and Thelma, not from Francis and Thelma, then the genetic analysis should be completely different. The kid's traits should be traced back to Mickey's genetic line, not the Griffin line. But the show doesn't do this because it's either forgotten about Mickey or retconned him out of existence. The ultimate problem with Peter's family tree is that it's been rewritten so many times, with so many contradictory flashbacks and revelations, that there's no coherent version anymore. Francis was his father, then Mickey was his father, then the show forgot about Mickey. Nate Griffin is his ancestor, except Peter's not genetically a Griffin, except all the Griffins look alike, including Peter. The family line is Irish Catholic, except there are black ancestors and English ancestors and who knows what else. Every time the show tries to establish Peter's heritage, it contradicts something that was established before. What makes this particularly emblematic of Family Guy's continuity problems is that this confusion affects one of the show's main characters and one of the most basic facts about him, who his parents are. This isn't an obscure detail about a side character. This is foundational information about Peter Griffin, and the show can't keep it straight. If they can't maintain consistency about something this basic, it's no wonder the rest of the show's continuity is a disaster. So, who is Peter's real father? According to one episode, it's Mickey McFinnigan. According to every other episode, it's functionally Francis Griffin. According to the visual evidence of ancestors, Peter is genetically connected to the Griffin line somehow. According to basic biology, none of this makes any sense. The Griffin family tree is a mess. Peter's parentage is a mystery wrapped in a retcon wrapped in a contradiction. And the show has long since given up trying to keep any of it straight. Peter's dad is whoever the writers need him to be for whatever episode they're writing. And if that contradicts every other episode, well, that's just Family Guy being Family Guy. The family tree doesn't branch so much as it twists into a pretzel and catches fire. Brian Griffin's backstory has been rewritten more times than probably any other character on Family Guy, and that's saying something for a show that treats continuity like a suggestion. We're talking about a character whose origin story has been fundamentally changed at least 4 times across different seasons, with each new version contradicting the previous ones so completely that there's no way to reconcile them into a single coherent narrative. Brian has been found as an adult stray, raised in a puppy mill, adopted as a puppy by the Griffins, and reunited with his original family, sometimes within the same season. It's like the writers keep forgetting what they established about Brian's past, and just invent new backstories whenever they need one for a particular episode. Let's start at the beginning with how Brian was introduced in the show's first season. In these early episodes, Brian is just part of the Griffin household, the talking dog who's been with the family for a while. There's no detailed origin story given initially. He's just there, an adult dog who can talk and drink and read, living with the Griffins. The assumption, based on how the character is presented, is that Brian has been with Peter and Lois for several years, long enough to be fully integrated into the family. He's not a new addition. He's an established member of the household who's been around for a significant period. The first real backstory we get for Brian comes in Season 1's Brian, Portrait of a Dog, where Peter takes Brian to obedience school. In this episode, there are references to Brian being found or adopted as an adult, though the details are vague. The implication is that Brian was already a grown dog when he came to live with the Griffins, that he wasn't raised by them from puppyhood. This makes sense with how the character is written. Brian is sophisticated, educated, well-read. He seems like a dog who had a life before the Griffins, who came to them already formed as a personality. But then we get to Season 2's Road to Rhode Island, which introduces Brian's mother and gives us our first detailed look at his past. In this episode, Brian and Stewie travel to Texas to pick up Brian's mother from a puppy mill where she's been living in terrible conditions. The episode establishes that Brian was born in a puppy mill, raised there for his early puppyhood, and presumably purchased or adopted from there. We see flashbacks of young Brian in the puppy mill, suggesting this is where his life began. This is fundamentally different from the earlier implication that he was found as an adult. Now he has a specific birthplace, a mother we can meet, a traumatic origin in a puppy mill that explains some of his neuroses. This puppy mill origin becomes Brian's accepted backstory for several seasons. When his past comes up in episodes, references are made to his time in the puppy mill, to his mother still being there, to the circumstances of his early life. It's treated as canon, the official version of Brian's origins. The show commits to this backstory enough that it becomes a recurring element of Brian's character, explaining his anxieties and his need for validation. Then Season 7 rolls around and completely upends everything with the episode, The Former Life of Brian. We've already discussed this episode in relation to Dylan, Brian's impossible son, but it also introduces major changes to Brian's origin story. In this episode, we learn that Brian had a whole previous life before the Griffins, including a girlfriend and a child. The timeline implications are messy, but what's relevant here is that this episode presents Brian as having been an independent adult with his own life and relationships before coming to live with the Griffins. He wasn't just adopted from a puppy mill as a puppy. He had a whole existence as an adult dog, making a living, having relationships, fathering a child. This contradicts the puppy mill backstory because it requires Brian to have had years of adult life between leaving the puppy mill and joining the Griffin family. If Brian is only 7 or 8 years old total, and he was a puppy in the puppy mill, and then he had time to grow up, have relationships, father a teenage son, and live independently. Before the Griffins, the math doesn't work. There aren't enough years in Brian's life to fit all these events. Either he's much older than established, which creates its own problems, or some of these backstories are wrong. But wait, it gets worse. In later seasons, there are flashback episodes showing home movies and family memories that include Brian as a puppy with the Griffin family. These flashbacks show young Chris and Meg, who are clearly children but not babies, playing with puppy Brian. This suggests that Brian came to the family when he was very young, that he was raised by the Griffins from puppyhood, that he didn't have a whole adult life before them. These flashbacks directly contradict both the adult adoption implication and the previous independent life we learned about in the Dylan episode. The most blatant contradiction comes in Season 19's The Birthday Bootlegger, where Brian is reunited with his original family, a completely different family from the Griffins. In this episode, we meet Brian's biological father and his siblings, and we learn that Brian was separated from this family when he was young. The episode treats this as Brian's real origin, his actual family before he ended up with the Griffins. But this completely contradicts the puppy mill origin from Road to Rhode Island. If Brian came from a family, he wasn't born in a puppy mill. If he was born in a puppy mill, he didn't come from a family. These two origins cannot both be true. The episode with Brian's original family even shows flashbacks of Brian as a puppy with his biological father and siblings, living what looks like a normal dog family life. There's no mention of a puppy mill, no reference to the traumatic origin established in Season 2. It's like that entire backstory was erased and replaced with this new family origin. And to make it even more confusing, this episode also doesn't really explain how Brian ended up with the Griffins. There's no clear transition from his biological family to the Griffin household. He was with his family, then he was with the Griffins, and how he got from point A to point B is left completely unclear. Let's try to create a timeline that accommodates all these different origin stories, just to see how impossible it is. Brian was born in a puppy mill to a mother who remained there, except he was actually born to a dog family with a father and siblings. Then he was either adopted from the puppy mill as a puppy or separated from his family somehow. Then he was raised by the Griffins from puppyhood, as shown in their home movies. Except he actually had an independent adult life where he had relationships and fathered a son before coming to live with the Griffins. Except he was also found as an adult stray and taken in by Peter. See the problem? These stories don't fit together. They're mutually exclusive versions of Brian's past, each one making the others impossible. The puppy mill mother story is particularly problematic because it's been referenced multiple times across different seasons. It's not just mentioned once and forgotten. Brian talks about his mother, goes to visit her, rescues her from the puppy mill. This is a recurring element of his backstory that the show committed to for years. But then the biological family episode acts like the puppy mill origin never happened. Brian's mother in the puppy mill presumably isn't the same as his mother in his biological family, unless we're supposed to believe his mother was in a puppy mill, but his father and siblings weren't, which raises even more questions. There's also the question of how Brian learned to talk, read, and develop human-level intelligence. In some episodes, it's suggested that Brian was always this way, that he was born with or developed these abilities naturally. In others, there are hints that maybe Peter or the Griffin family had something to do with Brian's development, that living with humans helped him become more human-like. But if Brian only came to live with the Griffins relatively recently, as some backstories suggest, then he must have developed his human characteristics elsewhere. Yet we never see other dogs in Brian's past who have similar abilities. His mother in the puppy mill is a regular dog. His biological family members, when we meet them, are regular dogs. Brian is unique in his human-like characteristics, and the show has never explained where these came from or how they developed. The show has also shown different versions of how Peter and Brian met. In some versions, Peter finds Brian as a stray and takes him in. In others, Brian is adopted more formally, implying he came from a shelter or rescue organization. In still others, Brian has been with the family so long that there's no clear first meeting moment. He's just always been there as far as the show is concerned. These different meeting stories contradict each other and add to the confusion about Brian's origins. What makes Brian's ever-changing origin particularly frustrating is that each individual backstory could work on its own. The puppy mill origin is compelling and gives Brian depth. The biological family reunion could be touching if it were his actual origin. The implications of Brian having a past life before the Griffins adds complexity to his character. But the show wants to use all of these backstories, pulling them out whenever convenient for a particular episode's plot, without caring that they contradict each other. It's like having a character who was raised by wolves in one episode, grew up in a wealthy family in another episode, and was found in a basket on someone's doorstep in a third episode, and expecting viewers to just accept all three versions simultaneously. Fan attempts to reconcile these contradictions have produced some creative theories. Some fans suggest that maybe Brian was born in a puppy mill to his biological mother, but his biological father and siblings were elsewhere, and after being separated from his mill mother, he was somehow reunited with his father's side of the family, but then separated again before ending up with the Griffins. This requires a lot of off-screen events that the show never depicts or references, but it's technically possible if you're willing to do enough mental gymnastics. Other fans propose that the different backstories are from different timelines or alternate universes, and that the time travel episodes and reality-bending episodes have somehow scrambled Brian's past. This theory has the advantage of potentially explaining any contradiction in the show by claiming it's from an alternate timeline, but it requires accepting that Family Guy operates on a multiverse level of complexity, which seems like overkill for explaining continuity errors. The most popular fan theory is simply that the writers don't care about Brian's backstory continuity and will invent whatever origin serves the needs of the current episode. This is almost certainly the correct explanation from a production standpoint. Each time the writers wanted to do a story about Brian's past, they created whatever backstory would make that story work, regardless of what had been established before. Need a story about Brian rescuing his mother? Puppy mill origin. Need a story about Brian meeting his biological family? Here's a completely different origin. Need home movies with Puppy Brian? He was raised by the Griffins. The backstory is whatever serves the immediate story needs. This approach to backstory is emblematic of Family Guy's broader continuity philosophy. Characters' pasts are malleable, changing to fit whatever story the writers want to tell. There's no showrunner or continuity editor saying, "Wait, this contradicts what we established in Season 2. Or, if there is someone pointing out the contradictions, nobody cares enough to change the script. The individual episode's comedy takes precedence over maintaining a coherent character history. What's particularly notable about Brian's origin contradictions is that they affect one of the show's main characters and one of its most popular characters. Brian is in almost every episode. He's a major part of the show's identity. You'd think the writers would want to maintain some consistency about his basic backstory. But instead, his origin story is the least consistent element of his character. We know more about his political views, his drinking habits, and his pretentious personality than we know about where he actually came from, because his origin keeps changing. The show occasionally seems aware of these contradictions and makes meta jokes about them. There are moments where Brian's past is referenced and the details don't quite match previous episodes, and a character will make a confused face or a joke will be made about not remembering things correctly. These meta moments acknowledge the continuity problems, but don't fix them. They're the show's way of saying, yes, we know this doesn't make sense. We're doing it anyway. From a character psychology standpoint, Brian's inconsistent origin creates problems for understanding his personality. Is his neurotic behavior a result of trauma from the puppy mill? Is his need for validation tied to being separated from his biological family? Is his intellectual pretension an overcompensation for being found as a stray? Different episodes suggest different psychological explanations for Brian's issues, depending on which origin story they're drawing from. But these explanations contradict each other, making it impossible to have a coherent understanding of what made Brian who he is. The biological family episode is particularly strange because it presents Brian's reunion with his family as this emotionally significant moment, like he's been separated from them and missing them his whole life. But if that were true, why has Brian never mentioned them before? Why hasn't he tried to find them? He's been with the Griffins for years. He has access to the internet. He could have looked for his family if they mattered to him. But in all the previous episodes dealing with Brian's past, his biological family is never mentioned, never hinted at, never part of his emotional landscape. They only exist in the episode where they're introduced, and then they disappear again, never to be referenced in future episodes. This pattern of introducing elements of Brian's past for one episode and then forgetting about them is consistent across his various origin stories. The puppy mill mother appears in her episode and then occasionally gets mentioned later, but she doesn't become a recurring part of Brian's life. Dylan, Brian's son, appears for a couple episodes and then vanishes. The biological family shows up once and disappears. It's like Brian's past is full of significant relationships and traumatic events that only matter for the 22 minutes of their respective episodes, after which Brian goes back to being the same character with no lasting impact from these supposedly important revelations. What makes this even more confusing is that Brian is supposed to be the stable, rational member of the Griffin household. He's the voice of reason, the one who's supposed to have his life together compared to the chaos of everyone else. But his backstory is more inconsistent than anyone else's in the show. Peter's past has its contradictions, but at least there's a general through line of him growing up in Quahog, meeting Lois, and starting a family. Brian's past is a completely different story in every episode that deals with it. For the rational character, he sure has an irrational and impossible history. The truth is that Brian's origin story is whatever the current episode needs it to be, and viewers are expected to either not notice the contradictions or not care about them. Was he born in a puppy mill? Sure, in that episode. Did he have a whole life before the Griffins? Absolutely, when that story needs to be told. Was he raised by the Griffins from puppyhood? Yes, in the flashback episodes. Does he have a biological family he was separated from? Of course, in that particular episode. All of these are true. None of these are true. And which one is canon depends entirely on which episode you're watching. Brian's past exists in a quantum state of superposition, simultaneously being all of these contradictory things, until an episode observes it and collapses it into whichever origin serves that episode's plot. It's Schrodinger's backstory, and Brian is trapped in the box with all of his contradictory pasts, unable to have just one coherent origin like a normal character. That's the price of being a main character on a show that treats continuity as an inconvenience rather than a foundation.